Welcome back. The Employment and Labour Minister Thulas Nxesi has defended the proposed amendments to the current Employment Equity Act. Now, these amendments are aimed at strengthening the government's ability to enforce racial equality in the workplace. And to discuss this is a little bit further, we're now joined by Zwelinzima Vavi, who is the General Secretary of the South African Federation of Trade Unions. Mr. Vavi, very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us and a warm welcome to the Globe.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for the honor of participating in your show. Thank you.
Indeed. Now, almost 20 years, the Employment Equity Act was passed. Have the reforms been swift and effective enough, or the wheels are simply turning slowly?
Well, there is no doubt that one of the most important pieces of legislation to be passed by this government was the employment equity legislation. Important because, as we know, we are emerging from a history of division, a history of apartheid and colonialism, a history where deliberately, for many decades, the previous regimes of the whites only would have done everything in their power to ensure that the black majority is kept in the bottom of the food chain in every respect. We're coming from a history where there was a job reservations that was somehow a response to the 1921 mine worker strike that ironically demanded socialism in a whites-only republic. This is a response, or this was a response to not only the Job Reservations Act, but to the Wage Act of that time. So over a long period of time, the regime of whites only would have ensured that black workers are just seen as part of the machines, not given the due recognition as workers in the workplace. And so when the legislation came in post-1994, it would have led to the celebration, in particular amongst black workers, who also needed a government that is sympathetic to their history, to their plight, to ensure that there is equity in the workplace. And regrettably, unfortunately, the pace of ensuring that that legislation come to a realization and a reality for many workers have been rather very disappointing. So any attempt by the Minister of Labour, Minister Thulas Nxesi, to pass a legislation that will ensure that the government have much more teeth to enforce that legislation is something that all unions that are progressive should welcome wholeheartedly.
And having said that, then, how much more needs to be done in terms of ensuring that the Act is enforced in order to drive, proper equity in South Africa's employment sector?
Well, on one of the criticisms we have made of our own selves as the trade unions is that we've been very, very slow in defending that gain and to drive it through strikes and demands, demonstrations and pickets. Companies have been almost left to do as they wish without any pressure. I mean, I can tell you now there has not been a single strike by any worker in this country demanding that the employment equity be enforced and be used as an instrument to transform the workplace across the board. And that has not happened, is what is leading to a very slow pace of implementing that legislation. I mean, recent reports suggest that so far, still 67% of all senior management positions in the private sector are held by white males, which is scandalous if you look at the fact that we're now 27 years down the line in terms of democracy in South Africa.
Then how much of an impact would it have in terms of introducing greater flexibility into a sector, Mr. Vavi, which government has highlighted as being an important driver of South Africa's post-COVID-19 recovery plan?
Look, we're witnessing progress in relation to the implementation of the Employment Equity Act in the public sector. There's greater participation of women, including in senior management positions. But even there, still, the most senior positions in the public sector are still dominated by, this time around, black males. And the females, despite the fact that they are dominating the lower ranks of the public sector, are not in the senior management position. That's the first problem. But in the private sector, in the main, the progress is of very, very slow pace. So a legislation that seeks to ensure that the Minister of Labour can intervene to correct that situation is something that we should welcome. More so, there should be no holy cows. There should be no attempt on the part of anybody to say that this sector of this economy, because it is sensitive to international tourism, we should go slow in relation to transforming it. That would be totally unfair, and that's why we think that the legislation must be implemented across the board.
You know, Mr. Vavi, I foresee difficulties in the implementation of these amendments. Firstly, with the introduction of Section 15A, which seeks to empower the minister to identify, national economic sectors and determine numerical targets for those sectors. And I suppose then that, this will render the bill or act meaningless, because the minister's targets are likely to be broad-based and will have little regard, for the targets which are tailored by individual employers to suit their employment equity plans. Am I correct in making that assertion?
I don't think you are correct. What options are left now for the minister? I mean, it's been over 20 years since that piece of legislation was passed by Parliament. 20 years, and have produced a situation where 67% of all senior management positions are still held by white males. That's a problem. What do? Do you say, please, we are on our knees, we want you to implement transformation, or do you begin to use the transformation mechanism at the hands of the legislatures, and that is to amend the law to give the minister some power to intervene? And there is no option. As long as that is not going to be totally mechanical, by the way. Empowerment goes with the training, goes with the deliberate program of the transference of skills from those that have them and to those that require empowerment programs. And if you don't take those two into consideration, you may just lead to a situation where down the line you're going to be accused of having driven the collapse of standards. We don't want standards to be collapsed. We want us to continue to be productive in the context of the capitalist globalization, and we don't want to be those guys that are somewhere in South Africa who are still chasing their transformation without chasing the need to empower workers and to adjust to the realities of the new world order, which is the fact that the machines are now beginning to play a key role in the production of all goods that humanity needs in the country. So we insist that even though the minister must be given the teeth, but at the same time, there should be an insistence on training and on transference of the skills.
And you mentioned, the possible collapse of standards, Mr. Vavi. And I suppose then, just in addition to what I mentioned earlier on, I mean, with this particular amendment, allowing the minister to impose such targets unilaterally without consulting the stakeholders other than the Employment Equity Commission, will this not lead to perhaps a one-size-fits-all approach that will not take into consideration some of the concerns of the other parties?
Well, I don't think that the minister, even though he will be given those powers to make those interventions, but surely no one operating within an open democratic society such as ours will totally ignore the views of employers and unions, workers, in each of the sectors where we need to speed up the process of transformation. So whilst the legislation will not oblige him to consult, but it would be in his own best interest to ensure that he consult, that he takes into on board the views of the employers, the employees, the trade unions in the sector, such that his interventions are not mechanical, but are informed by the realities that may be facing the different sectors of the economy.
All right, Mr. Zwelinzima Vavi, the General Secretary of the South African Federation of Trade Unions, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Mr. Vavi there, just commenting on the Minister of Employment and Labour, Thulas Nxesi, defending the proposed amendments to the Employment Equity Act. This is The Globe on SABC News. Let's take a quick break. We'll be back shortly.